This is National Native News. I'm Antonia Gonzalez. Members of the Native community are volunteering to keep watch on Native-owned businesses and Native nonprofit buildings in Minneapolis, Minnesota, as protests continue in the city after the death of George Floyd, an African-American man who died last week in police custody. A center which serves Native youth in the Twin Cities, McGeezy Communications, went up in flames Friday amid protests. The group has been around for more than 40 years and started with production of radio programming. Archives are reportedly safe. Native Roots radio host Robert Pilot, speaking with members of the Native community during an online forum over the weekend, described McGeezy as more than a building.
When you want to hear about the Leonard Peltier, McGeezy was there and nobody else was when Leonard Peltier was on trial, and so we owe a lot. There's a lot of John Trudell and Clyde and all the AIM people from the beginning, recordings there from the early 70s on.
Community members helped clean up the building over the weekend. Other areas people are gathering at are the Minneapolis American Indian Center and Powwow Grounds coffee shop. The 6 bands, which are part of the Minnesota Chippewa tribe, are holding primary elections next week. Reporter Melissa Townsend has more.
Mille Lacs, White Earth, Boys Fort, Leech Lake, Fond du Lac, and Grand Portage will be choosing candidates for board chairman and several district representative seats. The primary election was postponed from March 31st because of safety precautions due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Gary Frazier is the executive director of the Minnesota Chippewa tribe.
I think the voter turnout is going to be way lower than normal at the polls because they've been asking people to come vote by absentee for the last month and a half.
He says tribal leaders are taking a number of precautions to keep voters safe. Minnesota Chippewa tribe members can vote by absentee ballot up through June 9th. At polling places, some bands will practice social distancing, and some may require a temperature check before you can vote. If a person has an elevated temperature, they can get an absentee ballot. The candidates who make it through the primaries will run in the general election, and that's scheduled for August 18th.
That was Melissa Townsend reporting. The Canadian government is increasing the amount of money available to help Indigenous people living off reserve in the fight against COVID-19. As Dan Karpenchuk reports, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has announced an additional $75 million to the Indigenous Community Support Fund.
The money is aimed at Indigenous people across Canada who live off reserve. The Indigenous Community Support Fund was created in mid-March and included more than $300 million for regional, urban, and off-reserve Indigenous groups to confront the COVID-19 pandemic. Trudeau says topping up the fund for those living off reserve and in cities is needed because organizations that help Indigenous people there are facing a high demand for their services.
Indigenous community organizations in our cities and off-reserve do crucial work year-round, but these days their services are in high demand because of the pandemic. We need to make sure they have the resources to adapt and grow their services so they can fulfill their important mission.
Trudeau says there are as many as 1 million Indigenous people who live in Canada's urban centres or off-reserve. He says the support fund recognizes that the government must adapt its approach and programs to meet the needs of all Indigenous peoples. The money is expected to go to projects such as providing access to food, transportation, educational materials, and mental health services. Trudeau says it can also be used to buy sanitation and personal protective equipment. He says funding projects will begin rolling out in the coming weeks. For National Native News, I'm Dan Karpenchuk.
And I'm Antonia Gonzalez.
National Native News is produced by Koahnic Broadcast Corporation with funding by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Support by AARP CommunityConnections.org that connects you to help in your community and enables you to join or organize your own online mutual aid group, share ideas, and help your family, neighbors, and those most affected by COVID-19.
Support by BNSF Railway, moving our economy for over 165 years. Our vision is to operate injury and accident-free with safety programs, training, and technology. More at bnsf.com/tribal relations.
Native Voice One, the Native American Radio Network.